result. So I'm going to be starting by working the whip stitch seam, and this is probably the most common seam that people use on crochet. So I'm just going to secure my yarn here. It's a very easy seam to learn. Also it works up quite easily on both the sides and the heads of the stitches, so people often like that. The sides, I think, are where people find it more difficult to get the right kind of seam. The heads are much easier to match up, both sides of them, because it's a stitch at a time, whereas the sides of the stitches you need to work out how many times you need to stitch in the side of each crochet stitch. So I'll be working through that this morning. I'm going to turn this sideways on now, having secured the yarn, and I'm going to work a whip stitch seam, placing the right side. So this would be the wrong side of my fabric together. I've got the right sides here, and then I'm going to work the crochet seam here. So I'm just catching each time one thread, matching the stitches on each side. If I go through two threads or around the whole stitch, that's not going to be a very secure seam, because there's a longer gap here than if I work between just a thread at a time. I can work multiple stitches in the sewing stitches in the same crochet stitch, and additionally it would make the seam much bulkier if I went around multiple threads. So I'm making sure that I hold the crochet pieces of fabric at the same distance, so that the beginning and end are matched. On a longer piece you might want to use pins there. I might even pop a pin just in here to make sure that the stitches stay matched, and you could pin every so often throughout the seam. And then I'm going to be working a couple of stitches into the side of each crochet stitch, and initially I like to just pull each stitch one at a time like that, but as I go on, often I will do a few stitches like this, catching one stitch from each side every time, so the thread works up in almost a spiral motion. Got two threads there. This one's a little bit trickier. Let's catch that thread there and this one here, and then I can pull the threads up together after 2 or 3 stitches. That makes it a little bit quicker to seam, so this is a nice fast seam to work. So you can see on this side the seam is fairly visible. Let's take that pin out so I can catch the last stitches. And then I'm just going to pull this a little bit tighter along the length of it. But when we turn over, we'll probably see that the right sides of the fabric don't have such a visible seam. There we go. So that's the right side of the fabric there. And you can see even with this bright orange colour, there's not a lot showing. So that's how the seam works up on the sides of the stitches. It's probably the easiest and most popular seam to work there. Let's have a look and see how it works up on the heads of the stitches. Now my recommendation for working a whip stitch seam on the heads of the stitches is just to work through the back loops, because crochet stitches can be quite bulky, particularly in this kind of Aran cotton yarn, and if I went through both of those it might be too chunky. So I'm just going to go through the back loops here, and this is much easier to do because I can simply pair the stitches up and I don't have to worry about matching the ends of them, unless I'm gathering. If I was gathering one piece of fabric onto another, I'd probably pin that in place, or have a pattern mapped out that I'll seam X number of stitches on the longer piece to 1 stitch on the shorter piece. And these are quite easy to work into, with it being a larger yarn. Now you could use this whip stitch as a decorative feature on one side, because when I pull them tight it's actually visible on the side I'm working on. So if you put the crochet with the right sides together, you could actually make a feature of that seam there in the stitch heads by using a contrast colour of yarn. But even if you use the same colour of yarn, even on this which is usually considered to be the wrong side, the side you're working from, it's not particularly visible, so only in a contrast colour this would be easy to see. I've used this as a feature seam on my Granny's Captivated bag, where I think my outer rounds of the square are blue, and then I use a white thread in each of the stitches to whip stitch from the right side rather than the wrong side, and there I have a nice almost an embroidered effect. Okay, I'm just going to pull that a little bit tight. You can actually work quite a lot of stitches before doing that, so you can see this can look a really nice seam when you use a contrast colour. And then if you turn it over, you haven't got the stitch heads there, and so you've got quite an invisible seam. If this was in the same colour yarn, you wouldn't really see that at all. It would just look like part of the stitches as you continue into the next stitch. So that's the whip stitch